Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to ISSI's, the International Space Science Institute in Bern's Game Changer series. I welcome you to the 7th edition of Viewing Earth from Space, the changing environment and climate of our planet. And I'm particularly happy to have a very well-known guest speaker today, Professor Chris Rapley from University College of London, well-known. Chris is chair of the advisory board of the UCL Climate Action Unit. Before that, he was well known as the director of the British Museum between 2007 and 2010. And before that, he was the director of the British Antarctic Survey. He is actually the commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire and received several medals and scientific prizes. Chris, before he turned to Earth observation, was also a space scientist. He was at NASA at JPL. He was involved in the Solar Maximum mission and in the Cassini mission, but later he was absolutely instrumental for the European Space Agency for the definition of particularly the radar altimeter instruments on both ERS 1 and 2, as well as on ENVISAT. And he really pushed the use of those radar altimeters over polar regions and not only over water, but only over ice and snow. Today, Chris will present us creating agency to act on climate change. And before I hand the floor to Chris, I would kindly ask participants that we are not interrupting. Please put any questions that you may have to Chris, and I'm sure you will have questions. Put them in the chat. I will, after Chris's presentation, read them out to him so that he can answer and give comments back. And with that, I want to again thank you very, very much, Chris, for being prepared, taking the time to join us. And I turn the floor to you.
Thank you, Mike. Let me just start sharing my slides. So if you could just let me know if you can see those okay.
Yeah, they're fine.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to reconnect with ISSI. I've had some previous engagements with ISSI in the past, but not for a few years. So it's nice to be back, even if it's digitally rather than physically. So my talk this afternoon is about reacting to the threat and problem of climate change, but in fact creating agency to act in this sphere. The same principles apply more generally, but this talk is specifically about climate change. So Code Red, the IPCC Working Group 1 report that came out, the AR6 report that came out last November, pulled no punches. The story has been developing, for 30, 35 years now. And I guess those of us that have watched that story unfold weren't particularly surprised by the general content of the most recent IPCC report. What has, I think, startled us is the pace at which the climate system is responding to the driving forces that humans are exerting on it. And Antonio Guterres summarized it in a little phrase. He said, "This is code red for humanity." And those of us that have been watching this for a while believe that that is not an overstatement. We're in pretty serious trouble. And so while I was preparing this talk, it struck me that the world is quite different from 5 or 6 years ago. The planet is sending us stronger and stronger messages more and more frequently. And so there's this kind of drumbeat in the media of climate change stories. And so I just had a quick look around the internet over the weekend. And one of the first stories that popped up was this one about the Arctic. We have known that the ice snow albedo feedback would amplify warming in the Arctic and to some extent in the Antarctic, although that's a slightly different story. But this report said new data have revealed that extraordinary rates of global heating in the Arctic, up to 7 times faster than the global average in the Barents Sea area. And so that's, the kind of slightly unsettling report that is increasingly common. Same day, just hunting around, I think these were both from the BBC website. Italy's water supply at risk as largest rivers dry up. Authorities fear that if it doesn't rain soon, there'll be a serious shortage of water for drinking and irrigation. And of course, this story we see playing out around the world, California in particular, and the southern parts of the United States are all under serious water availability stress. This was an interesting one, quirky little one. African bee-eaters found nesting in Norfolk. So all of the twitchers, all of the bird watchers are racing over there to take pictures of them and spot them and log them in their books. But I mean, this is not normal. I used to be interested in bird watching. The idea that you would see African bee-eaters nesting in Norfolk was pretty far-fetched. And then another little one that popped up, the Everest base camp having to be moved because the glacier upon which it sits is now so unstable, it's becoming dangerous. And then again, over the weekend, or at least on Friday, Saturday, the prediction was of extreme and unusual temperatures across Europe. And indeed, we saw them. In fact, I think there was a 40.5 somewhere or other. So that's 110 degrees Fahrenheit in old units. And again, the attribution science has reached the point where the increased probability of those individual events relative to where we would have been if we had not injected greenhouse gases into the atmosphere the way we have and changed the land surface. That's getting to the point now where we can be pretty confident that these events are driven by global warming. And then just looking around today, the other side of the coin of warmer atmosphere is intense flooding, and an article on hundreds of thousands of people in China being threatened by extreme rainfall and flooding. So I trained as a physicist, and so going right back to basics, what we've done by being so industrious and pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, changing the radiative transfer through the atmosphere of heat, we've upset the energy balance of the planet. And so, the planet intercepts heat and light from the sun. Over its long history, it has radiated away that heat, having used it to drive the motions of the fluids, the ocean, the atmosphere, and also drive the biosphere. And that balance has been pretty exact to many decimal places, but now there's a 3% imbalance. That imbalance is equivalent to 20 times the energy that humanity generates each day to run the modern world. And it's the equivalent of all 8 billion of us residents of this little spaceship operating 40 1.5 kilowatt electric kettles and pouring hot water into the ocean. And that's not a bad analogy, as we'll see, because that's where most of the heat goes. But just before I leave this slide, this is a water vapor image from Meteosat, rather an old one actually. But what's interesting is, water vapor is the strongest greenhouse gas. And in the gaps in what would be the clear atmosphere in the visible, it's interesting that you cannot see the land surface beneath. You cannot see the contours of the coastlines of the world. And so that's a direct demonstration of the greenhouse effect. The heat that's making its way up from the surface is struggling to do so. It has to do so in several jumps before it reaches an altitude where the remaining atmosphere is thin enough for it to escape. And of course, convection carries heat up as well. But it's just a nice direct demonstration of the greenhouse effect. So 94% of that energy imbalance is disappearing into the ocean. We don't live in the ocean, so we're not directly aware of that. Ocean ecosystems are, and they're responding pretty strongly. 2% goes into the atmosphere that we experience, 2% into the land, and 2% into the ice. And as Mike mentioned, I've been really interested for 40 years in ice as a canary in the coal mine for climate change. If you have ice and snow close to the melting point, then even quite small changes in temperature will have a dramatic effect as the ice changes phase from a solid to a liquid. So what happens to this energy? Well, as the energy accumulates, the world warms, and we're about 1.2 degrees on average warmer than pre-industrial. Obviously, that's distributed unevenly across the planet, much greater increase in warming in the Arctic areas, as you just heard. Ice and snow melt, sea levels rise, both because the water expands and because ice on land either slides into the ocean where the hydrostatic effect lifts sea level, or it just melts and the water runs into the sea. Ocean and atmospheric circulation patterns change because the temperature differential between the equator and the pole changes, and that's the driving force. The water cycle accelerates. A warmer atmosphere can carry more water, 7% more moisture for every degree centigrade. And that does two things: makes the atmosphere much more efficient at sucking moisture out of the ground and the biosphere. And so that accelerates the occurrence of droughts, wildfires, and so on. But it also means that it precipitates more violently, so you get much more intense precipitation events, which lead to flash flooding. More generally, extreme weather events increase, ecosystems respond, food and water supplies are affected. The world we've built over the last 100 years, the sunk investment in buildings, railways, transport systems, infrastructure in general, was all designed for the climate system we inherited, not the one that we're provoking. So there's a big issue of either upgrading that infrastructure to be able to cope, or it being directly damaged before we're able to do so. So people and species are impacted, and economic and political stability are affected. So I've made this sound like a kind of linear cascade, but it's not a linear cascade. There are all sorts of feedbacks and interconnections, nonlinear interconnections in this whole coupled system. That mean that it's quite difficult to model, quite difficult to predict, not impossible, and the models do a pretty good job. But there will always be surprises in this system. And down at the level of human activities, economic and political stability, there are a whole range of interactions with other things that are going on. So, the fact that humans have a capacity to fight each other all the time is made worse by the interaction between those sort of activities and climate change. So I put together this little set of images which kind of summarize or illustrate a number of the consequences, everything from melting ice sheet through release of methane from the tundra, wildfires, storm surges, intense flooding, coastal erosion, and so on. But I'm not going to spend, I'm sure you're all very aware of these, you read about them all the time in the media, these consequences, but I just thought I'd pick on one of them because often we say, well, do you know what, we've been predicting all of this for a long time, which is true. But some of the nuances, some of the detail we didn't predict. And I don't recall anybody predicting 5 years ago that PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, the utility that provides California, one of the richest state on the richest nation on the planet, would file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and have to prepare to pay out something like $25.5 billion of compensation to 80,000 properties and businesses that were destroyed by wildfires that their faulty equipment ignited. So the class actions against them have caused them to go bankrupt. That wasn't foreseen. So the way that these consequences are playing out in day-to-day life are increasingly of concern. And just one little point about the increase in extreme events. If we pick the extreme events falling under and beyond the red line in this diagram, with the climate system that we inherited, the probability of that particular type of event, which I kind of chose not quite at random, is shown by the black dot. But it doesn't take much of a shift in the average for the probability of that extreme to be changed disproportionately. You can see that a very small shift has increased the probability of that type of event by a factor 5, maybe a bit more. And indeed, the area under the curve beyond that line, so the total probability, the cumulative probability of extreme events, some of which are now much warmer than had previously occurred, is also disproportionately increased. And this is just a straightforward piece of consequence from the statistics. This applies to changes in mean sea level, in rainfall, in the mean of any climate parameter. So it should be no surprise that we're seeing these extremes much more often than has been the case in the past. So just another point, this is a heat map of or temperature map of the world, but it's showing wet bulb temperature, not dry bulb temperature. So this is the temperature that a thermometer wrapped in a damp cloth would measure, and it's the temperature that is important from the point of view of human well-being. A wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees or so, we have been told in the past, is lethal for human beings. You can't radiate or evaporate away the heat of your metabolism, and so you begin to suffer from organ failure. And so temperatures of that or close to it are either incredibly uncomfortable or actually really dangerous for people working outside in agriculture or on building sites, or even just walking around. And a few years ago, a model suggested that if we had an extreme level of warming, and at the time it was seen as up at the top end of the possibilities, then the world could look like this towards the end of the century, with wet bulb temperatures over vast areas currently inhabited by billions of people, which would be uninhabitable. Now, I'm slightly embarrassed by this because some of you may know that the fashion designer Virginia Westwood is and has been for some time quite a climate activist. And her team asked me 6-7 years ago to be a science advisor to them. And I was happy to do that until she wanted to publish a pamphlet that showed this area of the world as uninhabitable. And I felt at the time very uncomfortable being associated with what I felt was not just an alarming, but an alarmist prediction. But in fact, just recently, the Met Office have come up with a very similar map showing wet bulb temperatures greater than 32 degrees in pretty much the same area. And essentially, those areas are in danger of becoming uninhabitable. And in the meantime, there's been a series of publications, well-refereed publications, that have looked at the future of the human niche, the emergence of heat and humidity too severe for human tolerance. It's begun to be available to the general public through websites like the BBC one. And interestingly, just a week or so ago, a new publication came out that said, by the way, that 35-degree wet bulb temperature limit, which has been bandied around and been the kind of conventional wisdom, is not right. And so a study showed that for healthy young people, 32 degrees is pretty much the limit. And indeed, it depends very much on the water vapor pressure, and it could be much less than that. So that reduction of that threshold has all sorts of implications about where we're heading. And of course, earlier this year, we had very high, very severe temperatures over that area. Delhi suffering 49 degrees. That climate change being estimated to be 100 times more likely than if we had not injected the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that we have. And a number of people have pointed out, if any of you have read the fiction book, The Ministry for the Future, chapter 1 starts out with such a heat wave. And so reality is kind of mimicking fiction at present. So what's the consequence of this? Well, this is an image from Damascus taken a few years ago, where following the 2007 to 2010 extreme droughts, which were calculated to be extremely unusual. I think I saw an estimate of the 1 in 1,000-year event. 1 million people were driven off the land because initially their crops failed, then their livestock died. And that 1 million displaced group joined the 2 million people displaced by the Iraq war, plus the existing residents of Damascus and Aleppo. And that exacerbated the civil unrest, and that then exacerbated the crackdown. And we all know the desperately unhappy story that then transpired and still is going on. It's not covered much in the news these days. But that drove a certain amount of migration. And it's interesting, in the most recent IPCC, I guess, Working Group 2 report, says up to 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. And that's a high confidence result, not just heat, that's with coastal sea level rise implications and lack of water and so on as well. So that unfortunate situation, that desperate situation in Syria contributed to, didn't cause, it contributed to the flux of migrants across the Mediterranean, which essentially destabilized European politics. I mean, here they were met by a wall in parts of Hungary, elsewhere they were welcomed. But I'm not saying that flux was caused by climate change. It certainly wasn't, but climate change contributed to it. It was a threat multiplier. And we know that the fear of migration was the dominant factor in the Brexit vote. And so, interestingly, in that year, 2014, the net influx of people to the UK was measured in the 100,000s. So the reality was that a tiny number of people, a tiny percentage, were actually immigrating to the UK. Nevertheless, it destabilized UK politics, that's destabilized European politics. So anybody who feels that because their house hasn't yet been flooded or hasn't caught fire, that they have escaped the consequences of climate change in Europe is wrong. We felt it through the social consequences. So moving on, we know that within this highly interconnected nonlinear system, the physical and chemical and biological elements of it, there are tipping points. And this diagram color codes where a few years ago these tipping points exist, and the color code indicates roughly where the science community has estimated there is a nonlinear irreversible threshold. So for increases in global warming, average global warming of 1 to 3 degrees, at risk are the Greenland ice sheet, Arctic summer sea ice, alpine glaciers, coral reefs, West Antarctic ice sheet, slightly higher temperatures, Amazon rainforest, and so on. I have to say that since this diagram was produced, the general consensus has been that it was probably optimistic, and there's a lot of concern that these tipping points, certainly the yellow ones, are already tipping. And of course, this is the background to the selection of the 1.5 to 2 degree guardrails in the Paris COP21 Accord. This is why those targets were set, to stay as close as we can to 1.5 and certainly not exceed 2, because once these tipping points start to tip, they can cascade. And at that point, we lose control. It's like a giant Jenga game. We still arguably have some control. We still have our hand on the carbon dioxide emissions control knob. We still have our hand on the control knob that may allow us to absorb some of the carbon dioxide that is currently sitting in the atmosphere. But once these tipping points start to tumble, then we just essentially have to sit back and let the physics, chemistry, and biology play out, adapting as best we can to where the planet heads. So it's not a good idea to lose control. So we need to take action. Now, just this lunchtime, this report came out from Carbon Tracker on unburnable carbon. And it shows on the right the remaining carbon budget, the blue, this is the budget for keeping below 1.5, the yellow for keeping below 1.7, and the orange keeping below 2. In the middle are the listed reserves. So these are the reserves that companies have on their books and essentially dictate their asset value to shareholders. And then on the left are the proved reserves. And of course, there's more out there to be discovered, and a number of companies are out there trying to increase the height of that bar. But what you can see is that if we were to burn all the listed reserves, we would breach 2 degrees. This is a 66% probability of remaining below that threshold. And if we were to burn the listed reserves and the proved reserves, we would be way away. So in this report, it says at the start of 2022, they estimate only 320 gigatons of CO2 equivalent remain if we're to keep below 1.5 with current rates. That means that we'll burn it all up in 8 years. And then they go on to say there's 3,700 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, which is 10 times the carbon budget out there. So essentially, we have to leave 90% of fossil fuel reserves in the ground if we're going to respect the 1.5 degree limit. And quite a few of my colleagues are pretty skeptical that will happen. But the consequence for the financial world is that just taking into account the fossil fuel reserves alone, that would mean that there would be $1 trillion worth of stranded asset. And if one takes into account all of the hardware infrastructure, all of the pipelines and drilling rigs and extraction rigs and so on, that figure goes up by another factor 3 or 4. So for the financial world, this should be a big headache. I'm no great fan of net zero, which, as you I'm sure know, is the much kind of vaunted objective: get us down by half by 2030 and to net zero by 2050. But this image at the top left illustrates the slavery abolition movement. And the abolitionists didn't say, well, do you know what, by 1830 we'll reduce slavery by half, and by 1850 we'll offset any residual slavery by good works. They said slavery is an abomination and we need to abolish it. And a similar absolute was adopted by the women's emancipation movement and by the civil rights movement in the US, and increasingly is the drumbeat of the climate justice movement, and also the students' movement. And so my concern is that net zero is a very comfortable slogan against which all sorts of things can be hidden, not least the fact that it assumes that we will find magical ways of sucking huge amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere. So my personal message is, let's say we'll abolish fossil fuels, and let's have an adult conversation about how we'll do that as quickly as possible. How are we doing? COP26 in Glasgow, characterized by Greta as blah, blah, blah. She wanted no more blah, 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 and tend to sympathize with her. There were some advances on forestry and a little bit on funding, 1 or 2 other things. But by and large, it wasn't the success that we had hoped for. And indeed, since then, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has shifted attention back on supplies of fossil fuels, and we're probably going backwards, not forwards, in terms of that desire to abolish fossil fuels. And the Climate Action Tracker analysis at the end of last year, you can see here the likely outcomes of existing policies, targets only, the pledges, most optimistic. By and large, the general feeling is that we're still on course for something like 2.5 degrees of warming. So we need to shift from this being an issue to it being an action. We need to reframe climate change in terms of action. And I just give a little preview because I'll come back to this. Interestingly, the European Space Agency delegates, the ministerial delegates, met earlier this year in Matosinhos in Portugal, and they came up with some very ambitious targets for the future. So 3 accelerators, one called Space for a Green Future, another one called Rapid and Resilient Crisis Response, extending far beyond just climate change, protection of space assets, footprints beyond the ISS and icy moon sample and return. And it's Space for a Green Future that I'll focus on. If you look at the space assets that are up there at present, 15 in operation, huge numbers under development. And if we take a figure of roughly €500,000 for each of those assets, we're talking about 8 billion euros worth of hardware orbiting right now, pumping back terabytes of data to help us decide how to manage our affairs in a way that would keep that fossil fuel in the ground. But of course, the irony is that there are 8 billion of these things, and it's these things that will actually dictate what happens. It's not the space hardware. These things are assisted by the space hardware and the computer models and all the rest of the kit that goes along with it. But in the end, it's decisions, it's choices made by 8 billion of these things, some more than others, that will dictate the future trajectory of the climate system. And so this has been an interest of mine. Well, you heard that I was director of the Science Museum. Understanding how these things respond to exhibits in the Science Museum was something that I took a great interest in when I was there. And it's something that I've really concentrated on since I moved back to UCL. It turns out that natural scientists, by and large, are pretty ignorant of what goes on inside this thing, which is kind of ironic because it is our most basic instrument, and understanding its strengths and weaknesses, its strengths and shortcomings is quite important. So the first thing I'd just point out is that the deliberative part, the bit that does science, the bit that thinks about things in a careful and slow and thoughtful way, is a tiny fraction of what's actually going on inside that thing. Those things are operating at about an exaflop, somewhere between 100 petaflops and an exaflop. Yours is right now, mine is right now. And for something that weighs 1.3 kilos and operates on 20 watts, that's pretty impressive. The current generation of exaflop computers run on 20 megawatts of power, weigh 270 tons. So there's a way to go before technology matches evolution. Anyway, most of what's going on inside your cranium is on automatic. Just give you a couple of illustrations. There's a wonderful neuroscientist who I worked with on and off in the past, a guy called Bo Lotto, and he produced this illustration a few years ago. And it's a fairly natural scene. You can see pretty clearly what's going on here. We have a room with a table and some tiles on the floor. Just draw your attention to these two tiles and then just expand them. And what you can see is that from the point of view of a physical instrument, these things should give the same signal. Those two tiles, they are in fact the exact same hue and intensity of gray. And so if we had a lab instrument, we would be disappointed if the instrument did not find that those two things gave the same signal. But in our heads, they give a completely different signal. One of them, the one in shade, looks much lighter than the one on the outside, because it would have to be so to look that way if it were in shadow. And the automatic processing system, our visual processing system in our heads, takes that context into account. And even though you know that the shade and intensity are identical, you cannot overrule the automatic processing system in your head that is telling you, no, that one must be lighter under the table. Now, why would this be of an advantage from an evolutionary point of view? Well, being able to tell the color of a poisonous snake, whether it is under the table or outside the table, is advantageous from an evolutionary point of view, distinguishing it from one that is not. So you can see why our systems might have evolved that way. And what we're seeing is not, as a physicist might expect, our heads generating an accurate model of the world using optical, visual and audio and other sensory inputs. It's offering you meaning and context. It's telling you how to survive in the world. It's helping you navigate the physical, biological, and social world. So our visual processors are hardwired. They're always on. They're in the hidden part. They're part of that exaflop processing. They err on the side of false positives because from an evolutionary point of view, that's advantageous. So here's another image. This is of a bunch of kids in a horror house, an amusement item somewhere in the States. And they've just seen something frightening. I don't even know what it is. But what's interesting that all of them have responded at the sort of 200, 300 millisecond time level, as fast as Usain Bolt responds to the starting gun. Their hands have come up to protect their chests. Their mouths have opened to suck in an extra bunch of oxygen to energize their muscular system. Their eyes have opened wide to see if there's, to open up the field of view to protect against other possible associated dangers. This is completely involuntary. And so speed of reaction is something that this exaflop machine that sits inside our heads serves at a premium. It even does it in conversation. We speak 2 to 3 words a second. And so our onboard systems are listening to conversations and coming up with language at the 100 millisecond time level so that we can formulate words in our throats. Takes, I don't know, 30, 40 muscles to tense in order to be able to speak a word. So speed of reaction is absolutely fundamental to our well-being, our survival, and our ability to navigate both the physical world and the social world. If a tree tumbles over, we've got a few hundred milliseconds to react and to get out of the way. So this system is responding to stimuli constantly, all the time. And the way it responds to the various stimuli is hardwired. So there are all sorts of filters and factors about which we can do little, we're even unaware, ranging from nature through to nurture. So if we look on the left, evolutionary history, biological factors, genetic factors, then memories and experiences, because we learn, physical sensations, you know, the heat, the light, emotions and mood, we react differently if we're in a good mood from if we're in a bad mood, pressures from the social environment, how we conform in the social world, influences from our cultural heritage. All of these shape our instantaneous and rapid response to stimuli. So when something happens, there's an input of some sort, this lot light up, some more than others, depending on the nature of the input. And they stimulate an immediate few hundred millisecond sensation, the feeling of reaction, of fear, of despair, of like, of laughter. And those all too often dictate our decisions, our choices, and our reactions, because engaging our deliberative mode of thinking, our thoughts, is hard work. And most of the time we don't bother. Most of the time we react on the basis of habit or the net input of these other factors. So this comes from a book by Burton, but the headline, identifying our Paleolithic Mark I brain as a machine for jumping to conclusions, is a phrase that Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning economist, came up with, because he studied the way people actually respond and make choices as opposed to the assumptions made particularly in free market economic models, which basically are based on an assumption which is the equivalent that, you know, gravity works sideways in physical models. Now, one of the things which is an assumption that we commonly make, because we're so keen to see cause and effect, to identify and understand and interpret cause and effect, is that we assume that information drives beliefs and attitudes, and that these then drive behavior. But there's a massive body of experimental literature from the mind sciences that show this isn't the case. So information doesn't necessarily drive beliefs and attitudes certainly don't necessarily drive behavior. Sometimes they do, but not as a norm in the way that we tend to assume. And the reason is that there are inabilities to overcome barriers. So there are psychological barriers. The irony is the better you tell the story of climate change, the more likely you are to drive negative reactions of fear, anxiety, loss, and helplessness. And so those are the first barriers you have to overcome. But secondly, if one overcomes those and actually wants to do something about climate change, there are all sorts of institutional barriers. Maybe those sunk assets are a real problem in the decision making, but there will be many other things. Maybe you have a very climate skeptic boss or a bunch of colleagues or whatever. There will always be problems to overcome. And so what people are constantly looking for is the agency, the ability, the knowledge and capacity to act on climate change. And in real life, by and large, it's actions that drive beliefs and not the other way around. You take an action, or a group of you takes an action. You don't like to think of yourselves as being dumb people. You're clever people. You, both for yourself and for others, come up with arguments that explain why what you did made sense, and that then reinforces your beliefs, and you continue to make more. And the best beliefs are those that are generated within inside your head. The best persuasion is self-persuasion, not external persuasion. And so these insights are some of 7 key insights that, working with a very interesting group of people for the last 6 or 7 years, but in particular with my neuroscience colleague, Krista Mayer, are the equivalent of kind of laws of human behavior, laws of how the mind reacts to the world around it, which, once you understand them, really help in terms of interpreting what's going on and how to make a difference. So we've been applying these. Mike mentioned that we set up, well, he mentioned that I'm the chair of the advisory board of the Climate Action Unit. It spun out of a policy commission that I've been running for some time. But we use these 7 insights to work with protagonists who are stuck, communities of place, communities of practice, organizations that want to do something about climate change but are stuck, they lack agency. So we work with them in a bespoke, facilitated way, bringing other experts in and joining them together, again, very carefully, because it's not an easy thing to do, to help them understand why they're paralyzed, figure out what it is they need to do and how to do it, and then helping them actually execute that, find their agency and implement it. And we've been doing this in the domain of climate science and society. So let's just quickly run through what that is. So where do decisions get made? Well, senior political and business decision makers and the general public are where the actions that humanity, those 8 billion brains, that's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, in terms of climate action. And of course, the senior decision makers, particularly in politics, and the general public are interlinked by the democratic or other systems. And so there's an interaction between these 2 groups. And then over on the left, I put the climate science community, in which I include all that $8 billion euros worth of satellite hardware, the computer models. Just unpacking that orange or tan box on the left is a really interesting exercise. It is not free of problems and issues, but that's another talk. Anyway, so how do these interact? Well, one way is through a set of interpreters, brokers, officials, and professional analysts with whom we can speak pretty much as we would speak to other scientists, other climate scientists, because they've got the collateral knowledge and insight, the language and the understanding for that to be possible. So that's fairly comfortable. There you probably can use the linear model, act as an honest broker, telling them, what the consequences of their actions and choices would be, and co-producing briefings for the decision makers for them. It's very much like a spying agency. The spies generate a bunch of information. somebody has to analyze that, sift it, make sense of it, and turn it into briefings for the decision makers. Sometimes, however, we get the opportunity to speak to those decision makers directly. And anybody who's spoken to a minister or a senior business leader with the kind of the elevator conversation type opportunity knows that you need to adopt a totally different approach, one that by and large we're not trained to do, or rarely, and one which requires a different skill set, a narrative skill set, an understanding of what it's like to be inside those people's heads, something that an increasing number of our colleagues are getting practiced at, but something that you certainly weren't trained for, in my experience, as you became the ologist or engineer that you are. Similarly, if one's talking to the general public, it's not just that you need to use a different language, that you can't assume the collateral knowledge. You need to operate in a narrative space, telling stories, because that's what the Mark I Paleolithic brain links into. And of course, then there are other big players in this game: the media, the arts museum, theatre, the legal system, increasingly engaged as climate change falls into the characteristic of being reasonably foreseeable, and hence something that the law can have traction with. So the Climate Action Unit has been identifying institutions, communities of practice, and places that are stuck wanting to do something about climate change. So it's a subset. I'm not talking about people who are denying it and or even trying to prevent things happening. Talking about people who are willing but stuck. And we've been intervening with those officials, with the decision makers, with the general public, with the media, with the arts and museums, and most recently, a couple of days ago, with senior law firms, 100 lawyers we were dealing with the other day. And we operate through facilitated bespoke dialogue and get inside people's heads, help them figure out how to find and deliver their agency to act. And time is tight, so I won't take you through these various examples of the sorts of groups of people that we've been dealing with, but they range from senior decision makers in UK, Chinese departments of state, individual MPs and members of the House of Lords, local councils, the Welsh government, bringing together food, health, and nature with the government in a way that has never happened before, people who've never spoken to each other before, addressing how to work together to develop policy to address climate change, and so on. And what we're seeing is that people who've been doing this for years are saying, wow, these insights are really giving us an edge. In one workshop, I learned more than in 15 years of working on climate change. This is from somebody who's been acting as a broker in this field for years. So if we go back to Space for the Green Future, seems to me that, and certainly in the Bonn Living Planet Symposium, I was pushing this quite hard, based on these mind science insights and the experience that we built up in this Climate Action Unit, which is fairly unusual. It's not completely unique, but it's fairly unusual, is that in order to link the information and knowledge that is being generated by that 8 billion euros worth of hardware, soon to be joined by more, why don't we set up multiple agile intervention units, exploit those insights, connect the creators and users of knowledge and information well out in the areas of society that are currently disconnected and stuck, dismantle those barriers to engagement actively, facilitate the co-production of agency, and accelerate the scale and pace of green action. So I'll finish by saying, the future is as yet unwritten. You and I, with our Mark I Paleolithic brains, have the, and our professional and personal ability to influence the world around us, can write the future. We need to do it now. It needs to be green, not red. Code red for humanity is not the place we need to be. And green is the color of hope. And these talks always need to leave an aftertaste. And the aftertaste needs to be green, hopeful. We understand how we can help people use the technology which we know is available to address these issues. And so we need to apply it. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Chris, for a most interesting, but in certain extents also unsettling talk, of course, but you warned us beforehand. Thanks a million for these insights. I would like to encourage the attendees and the participants to the call to please put their questions in the chat. I have many, and I asked one of those already at the Living Planet Symposium, and you then answered it. I just read out a comment that was actually at the beginning of your presentation when you talked about the fuel reserves and you call them an asset. And I got a bit of a protest here in the commentaries that Alison wrote, they are not an asset, they are a liability. And how would you react to that comment, Chris?
Well, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. As a climate scientist and a human being, yes. Unfortunately, what goes on in the world is strongly dominated by the financial world and the financial centers. That report that just came out this afternoon, I recommend it. There are some other figures in there that show the extent to which the various stock exchanges and various companies around the world have their share of these $1 trillion worth of stranded assets. And the problem is that they still see them as assets and not as liabilities. And that's going to be one of the biggest headaches, because the whole financial system is based on an assumption that those things have value. Yeah. And when it turns out that they do not have value, then we are in danger of a financial crash even bigger than the one we saw in 2008, which of course had huge knock-on consequences around the world. So managing ourselves out of those, of the view that they are assets and the recognition that they are liabilities is one of the key next steps.
Yeah. Chris, in your one but last slide where you showed also the different agents for the agency to act, the lawyers, the theaters, it brought me back to the resemblance and to the thought that many years ago, and you and I, we often sat in the same conference room when it was about the power of altimetry, and you predicted at the time that altimetry will be the undisputable tool to let us quantify sea level rise. I remember that very vividly, and to this very day, it's become totally undisputable. But there are other things. You've shown many slides, not only about the greenhouse agent, water vapor, but also we have global sea surface and land surface temperatures that show the trend that social drift, and they are undisputable. My question to you is, I see still, and I'm here, you see, I'm in a meeting room of the Potsdam Institute for Climate, where I'm attending a workshop. At that workshop, they showed the power of imaging spectroscopy, where you can see that heat waves and too strong irradiation from the sun can really hamper the growth of crop and stuff like that. But I still see there is a translationary link missing between those media that you have been pinpointing in your one but last slide, and what space agencies, what space can provide, which meanwhile has become a quantum leap in terms of real undisputably quantifying climate change. What would you recommend to us, what we can do to make this translation a little bit better? Because I feel that many citizens out there get tired of the shocking pictures.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. I mean, firstly, just can I say about sea level rise? If I'm asked for the two most important visual representations of science from the last century and where we are in this century, the ice core record, the 850,000 year ice core record of CO2 and temperature and methane is one, and the sea level rise record, both from tide gauges and from altimetry, is the other. And if I'm only allowed to show one to an audience, to show them a piece of science, I show them the sea level rise. Because I know these days people aren't so familiar with liquid thermometers, but certainly as a kid, you know, it was either mercury or alcohol in a tube that you used to measure temperature. These days, of course, everybody uses digital systems, but the liquid on the surface of the planet, it's only 4 kilometers deep on average, so it's pretty thin layer. But its expansion is exactly equivalent to a liquid thermometer. As it expands, it tells you that the temperature is rising. It's held on by gravity, not contained within a tube. But the sea level rise data is a direct thermometer of the global system. It integrates that 94% of the heat that's going into the ocean. And it's worrying because it's accelerating. The sea level rise was pretty constant for about 2,000 years. And then once the Industrial Revolution started, it started to shift quite quickly, which is interesting. But it was 1.8 millimeters per year, 18 centimeters per century last century. For a while this century, it was running at about 30 centimeters per century. It's now running at about 45. Some people even estimate 50. And it's worth taking into account that in the transition from the last ice age to the current interglacial, the sustained rate of sea level rise through that natural process was 1 meter per century. So we're running at about half the rate at present. And we've kicked that off in 100 years. So that's 1,000 times, well, certainly 100 times faster, if not 1,000 times faster. So for me, the sea level rise thing, I think still is, that's the iconic thing that I would put on my wall if I wanted to sleep less well. In terms of what all this hardware is there for, its use largely sits within that tan box, within the climate science community, to help us monitor, understand, focus, see where the real, no pun intended, hotspots are, so that we can advise those brokers to help people determine what policy to execute. So the main benefit is the traditional one, the IPCC-like one, the UK Climate Change Committee type thing. In terms of showing that stuff to the general public, graphs don't grab it really. That's why I use strong imagery and large tabloid-like headlines, because they go through the visual circuitry. But as I've said, scaring people, unfortunately, really doesn't do it. It grabs their attention maybe for a while, but it shuts them down. It makes them stuck. That's that first psychological thing. So we need to tell stories, and we need to tell stories of things that are happening. I can look out of my loft window, and I live on a small estate of 25 relatively, modern homes that were built 40 years ago. One of our neighbors has been the first to break through and get solar panels on their roof. And he is telling us all about how much money he's making, particularly in this hot weather, because he's off grid. And I know that, we are so socially influenced. I know that several other people now are saying, well, how did you actually do that? And though I can guarantee that within the next year, a number of solar panels will appear on roofs. That's the key. Telling stories, and particularly stories that enable people to find their agency, is the way that we can make progress. And so there's a bit of a disconnect, I'm afraid, between that hardcore data which is coming down from the satellites. And one of the misconceptions you see with the Copernicus, the Sentinel, the services, that there is a tendency, the same is true with Esrin and so on, there is a tendency always with engineers and scientists to say, well, we haven't got as many users as we'd like. We'll make the user interface even easier. We'll have bigger buttons, and we'll have more glorified color schemes and so on. And that may help the aficionados. It may help a small subset of people, citizen scientists on the web who get engaged. But with the woman on the street, and I think I saw a question about that it really isn't it. Telling stories about how they can engage in a way that is meaningful and doable is the route.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just saw from Steve Schwartz the comment if it's possible to share the recording of the presentation, and I've asked my colleagues at ISI to put the hyperlink where the video will be recorded into the chat. You will find it in there. Chris, you have just referred and you've answered the question of Manfred Schüssler, who asked, could you expand somewhat on how to interact with the general public, i.e. the woman in the street? And now I get another point, an interesting one from Alison again, and I read it out to you. Is anyone actually discussing out-of-the-box solutions? Example, if countries could learn to trust each other and work together, we could install solar panel farms in the desert band. Such strips would easily supply the energy needs for the world and bring revenue to these countries. This is the level where we need trust, solutions, and action. And it is the level where we have made least progress. If anything, the world is currently going in the opposite direction. True. Yeah. Policymakers tend to dismiss ideas like this, but we no longer have that luxury. Any comments from your side?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it goes right to the heart of why, as a natural scientist, I've ended up in this strange domain of the mind sciences and the social sciences, because we've got the technology. I mean, maybe not all of it, but we've certainly could do much better than we have been doing. We've known this story for 40 years. I look back at that original ice altimetry document that we produced for ESA in 1982. I was reading it the other day and I was thinking, oh my God, this guy knows what he's talking about. And I thought, oh yeah, that was me actually, because we were talking about this 40 years ago. We've known what to do. The technology, if you look at the cost curves for solar panels, they have plummeted every year. The International Energy Agency predicts penetration of the market, which is way off what actually happens. So we're doing pretty well, but the scale and pace have to accelerate. The technology is there. The ideas are there. The smart people are there. We need all of it. Al Gore says there's no silver bullet. You need silver buckshot. You need to throw everything at it, and you certainly don't need to imagine that you're going to solve it by phantom unicorn-like technology that doesn't exist yet, that's going to suck huge amounts of CO2 out of the atmosphere. But on the other hand, rewilding, soil carbon, we know there's a whole plethora of stuff out there. The problem is the social world. It's what goes on in those 8 billion heads. And unfortunately, it's what goes on in that tiny subset that are the government of, for example, the United Kingdom, of the European Union and its nations, which are not stepping up to the mark. In fact, they are currently, in many cases, going in exactly the wrong direction. And I mean, the invasion by one nation of another nation really doesn't help. So that's why understanding this Mark I Paleolithic brain and trying to figure out how to overcome its shortcomings is so crucial. That's what I've been investing the last 6 years of my life in.
I have one last comment from Aurelian Creda, and before I read it out, the question is, should we stop growth? Because it's been calculated here in this chat that note that was 2% growth of our energy consumption per year, present rate. We need to cover the entire planet by solar panels in less than 450 years. So we must stop growth now. Now, I would guess that our technology advances into 450 years will be such that we have more elegant solutions by that time rather than the current state-of-the-art solar panels. But I think it's an interesting aspect that's raised here in terms of growth. What's your
two very quick responses, because I was sensitive we're overrunning a bit, but everybody's happy, I'm happy. There's an equation called the IPAT equation. The impact of humans on the planet is the multiplicative factor of population, economic activity, and the carbon intensity of that economic activity. And unfortunately, population is still increasing. It's not accelerating in the way it was, but we're going to top out at what, 10 billion or something if we're lucky. So this, and that whole business, which might have been dealt with 50 years ago, that battle was lost, and I was involved in that a little bit at one point. So we're not controlling population. I mean, there were attempts, China and its one-child policy and so on. So there were some valiant attempts. We can talk about the ethics of all of that separately. The economy depends on growth. This was explained to me by an economist, and the penny dropped a few years ago. The advent of technology always makes production more efficient, and therefore the need for workers is reduced. So you either have to have a society in which it is accepted that people can be given money by the state even though they are not working. But if we stick with the model that you only gain money if you work, then the economy always has to grow as technology increases the efficiency of action in business. And so we haven't cracked that. And with market-driven economics, which is the model which is, it's more than a model, it's a religion which has taken over the planet. You know, free market economics is an insanity, but I'm afraid it's locked in. So we can't do much about that. So the only control knob we're left with is reducing the carbon intensity of activity in the economy. So, you know, you find a politician who will accept zero or non-growth. It's happening in the UK, actually, and it's creating mayhem. Yeah. I was going to make one last comment, and that was just about, you know, talking to people. One of my colleagues, George Marshall, who's very much on the same page with this, trying to understand how humans behave, told me a few years ago that he had set himself a target that every day he was going to pick on some unsuspecting individual in the public and talk to them about climate change. This is when climate change was still very much a Cinderella, you know, ooh, don't talk to me about that subject. It's less so these days. So, for example, when I tell people I'm a climate scientist these days, they don't run away. Sometimes they even say, oh, could you explain this to me? But I was traveling back from Waterloo Station in London on a very packed commuter train in the evening after he had told me this. And I was trapped in the vestibule with about 30 other British commuters who were all being very British, reading their evening newspapers and trying not to touch each other and not to talk each other. And I thought to myself, well, Chris, this is your chance. This is your... This is your opportunity to have a chat with these adult people about climate change. And I looked at them and I bottled out. I'm afraid I didn't do it. But actually talking to people, raising the conversation, having an adult conversation, not making it a finger pointy, you know, accusative. It cannot be a tyranny. It has to be framed as, well, look, you know, we're all where we are. We would regret it, but let's not talk about that. What can we do as a collective group of smart people to make our way forward? And that's it. That's what we have to do.
There are more comments in, but I will read one last one out to you. And that is from Stefan Schröder, and he says the communication strategy that you outline applies to democracies, and I do agree with Stefan here. How can you prevent countries with autocratic regimes whose power derives from fossil fuel exploitation to continue doing that? You see how reduced oil gas flow from Russia to Europe are immediately compensated by increased sales to Asia.
Yeah, it's really difficult. Again, I go back to the 7 principles. You have to imagine yourself. You know, I shouldn't call out names. Actually, you have to imagine yourself as a leader in a particular mode of operation, and you have to say to yourself, you know, can I get inside that individual's head? Can I see a way of framing this so that we can align their interests and the interests of society, and it's not well, we are damaging the planet, but the planet will recover. It's society that we need to worry about. Is there some way that we can get inside that individual's head to better align the policies and actions that they execute with a better future for the rest of the world? And I mean, it was interesting. There was an exercise a few years ago, and it sounds a bit corny, but it was an exercise in the, you know, the Bible Belt in the US, an exercise which was called, you know, what car would Jesus drive? And you might sort of go, oh, really? But actually, it engaged a bunch of people who up until then, if you mentioned climate change, would just shut down. You know, it was part of a package of things which they rail against. But that conversation got people going. I know what the result was. I think they decided he'd drive a Prius, and young people decided he probably wouldn't want a car at all. But the point was that it with our value set, and I'm sorry, I'm making an assumption about this audience, but it's a reasonable one. With our value set, we see the world in a particular way, but we are the minority. We are the tiny minority of the world. And the more we can do to get inside other people's heads and ask ourselves, how can I help that person find agency? And then we can make progress. And whatever you think of Al Gore, I worked with Al Gore when he was in the UK some years ago, when he was giving his Inconvenient Truth training sessions. And asking him literally over a beer, what would you say was the single most important item in your quiver to make progress? And he said shoe leather. He said, honestly, he said, as an American politician on the stump from the deep South, where that sort of biblical, tradition exists, said you just have to, keep going out and talking to people. You wear your shoes out, but talking to people and face to face is better than 2D and better than via print and so on. Just talk to people. There'll be some people you'll never shift, and to some extent, you shouldn't waste your time on them. There's a neuroscientist in the States who said, "Tell me your views on climate change, and I'll tell you who you are." Because if you tell me it's a spoof by the Chinese, then I know your value set, I know your belief set, because it's part of an integral package, and I know that there's not much I can probably do for you other than the sort of thing I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. But there's a vast group of people out there who are literally stuck. They want to do something, but they don't know what to do, and talking to them can help them.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Thanks ever so much, not only for a brilliant presentation, but also for a most exciting panel discussion afterwards. Personally, I am motivated even more to help create agency, as we've all in that business done before. I have seen many thank yous about your inspiring talk here in the chat, and people think that it's really been, how can I say, impressing them. In that sense, thanks a million for taking the time and for being with us. And before I close, I just would like to make a small hint for next week, next Thursday. The Game Changer seminar will start half an hour earlier at 16:30 CET, and we will have a presentation on the UCL Climate Change Initiative by Clement Abergel. But again, in closing, thanks the audience and the attendees for being with us. And again, many, many thanks for the most inspiring talk, Chris, and you have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it. It's a pleasure. And I'm happy to, if people want to contact me with other questions, I'd be very happy to try and answer them. Anyway, have a good evening.
Thanks a million. All the best.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.